Since Genshin Impact's release in September, we've seen several new characters and have begun to explore many aspects of the game's mechanics. But something that seems to continually cause trouble for players, both new and experienced, is gaining a good working understanding of the hidden roles within Genshin Impact, and how understanding those roles will help you decide what weapons and artifacts should be used on each character. All of these concepts help to ensure the creation of a more effective team. To more effectively convey these ideas, I've separated the key concepts of this guide into 3 separate videos. Those concepts will be as follows: roles defined, reactions and resonance, and what artifacts should I use. Without any further delay, let's get into it. Genshin Impact's roster of characters are each actually designed to fit certain roles which have silently emerged as the game establishes itself. The reason why it's important to understand these roles is because not every character is naturally suited to be the cornerstone of your team, providing consistent and reliable DPS. Some characters are designed to fill more supportive roles, helping characters in your team to deal more damage instead. Some are designed to provide large damage output only under certain circumstances. With that said, it's easy to get confused by utilizing inopportune configurations, resulting in a character which underperforms despite significant material investment. Here I've prepared a list of recommended roles for each character on the roster. It is worth noting that just because the character does not appear in a given role here, does not mean that they cannot be used in that role. However, it does mean that through my experience and testing, that I do not suggest a character be used in that role if you have other options available to you. The full chart will be revealed as the video progresses. Additionally, upon release of this video, the completed chart has been made available in full over on the Teyvat Historia Discord. Look for the Teyvat Historia official resources channel. There you will find all guides and charts that I have developed for this video series to help the community to my fullest. If you find the charts helpful, feel free to share them as you wish. The first role to discuss is primary DPS. DPS characters are those which generally focus not on large burst output, but rather the primary focus is on consistent damage output through the use of normal attacks, and sometimes through the use of external factors which tack on additional damage. This character is likely to be the character on the field most often. In most cases, primary DPS characters will be less dependent on skill cooldowns for damage production. For these reasons, this character will be the most important character in your core team, and should be given priority when it comes to ascension materials, artifacts, talent books, and weapons. With regard to the talent books, you may fairly easily get multiple talents to level 6, but going beyond that is more of a long-term investment. Thusly, focusing on the skill that the character is most likely to utilize regularly will provide better returns for that investment. For most primary DPS, that means investing heavily in normal attacks. A primary DPS should be built to utilize attack or corresponding elemental traits, in addition to crit rate of at least 50% and a crit damage of 100% or more. In many cases, upon reaching 50% crit rate, your production will be reliable enough to allow you a greater focus on crit damage, giving you an opportunity to produce crit damage numbers well north of 100%. In fact, it is not unheard of to achieve crit damage numbers of 150% or in some cases, closer to 200%. The next role I will discuss is secondary DPS. This role is usually dedicated to rounding out the weak points of your primary DPS. Some secondary DPS may have limited potential to produce even higher output than your selected primary, but only during limited window on a long cooldown. An example of this would be characters such as Child, who has significantly higher output when using Foul Legacy Rising Tide, but loses much of that potential while the skill is on its long 45-second cooldown. It is also worth noting that because the timer on the skill doesn't even begin until the skill has run its course, weapons such as Sacrificial Bow cannot be used to ensure consistent use of the ability, which is what makes Child generally more appropriate as a secondary DPS as opposed to a primary, unless you were fortunate enough or dedicated enough to reach C6 with Child, which changes his role to that of a primary, so long as his elemental burst is used primarily as a means to re-enter his melee stance immediately. Talent focus beyond level 6 on a secondary DPS should often go to normal attack, with exceptions to specific characters if their use on your team results generally in the use of their elemental skills, in which case, focusing on those will be more impactful. As for a secondary DPS's build, it should largely focus on the same stats as that which would be used on a primary DPS. The next role is Damage Dealer. Their intent is to work in tandem with your primary DPS by opportunistically swapping characters to charge up and use elemental bursts, or to counter enemies your primary DPS is ill-equipped to handle. Upgrade materials and equipment priority to these characters will be dependent on the needs of your team, and what sort of team comp you are looking to develop. But in general, it can be expected that normal attacks will be a lower priority on such characters. A damage dealer's build focus will be somewhat similar again to a primary DPS, but often instead of doubling down on sets which boost attack stats or the damage of respective elemental traits, as well as normal and charged attacks, the latter is substituted with set bonuses which benefit elemental bursts directly, such as 2-piece bonuses of the Noblesse Oblige set. The final role is support. This role is by nature a bit more diverse in Genshin Impact, and is defined by the characters which will provide reaction damage, healing, defensive capabilities, status changes, debuffs, or other utilities to your party. Some characters will provide pure support, and sometimes, with certain team comps, your secondary DPS will actually substitute into this role due to the nature of their usage. An example of this would be using characters such as Diluc or Klee as setters of the Pyro element for Mona, built as a primary DPS to trigger. Whereas by contrast, a character built as a reaction support will heavily utilize artifact sets which boost elemental mastery, and will be a character that you use purely to trigger reaction damage. Now that we've established the following roles, primary DPS, secondary DPS, damage dealer, and support, it's important to understand that the most effective teams will consist of a primary DPS, a secondary DPS, and 2 support, where one of these support roles will likely be a healer if the team concept is not built around shields. And in some team configurations, those supports will be a secondary DPS or damage dealer, subbing as a support. Selecting which characters you should use for your core team depends on many factors, some unique to your own circumstances, including, but not limited to, character and weapon availability, which will lead to other avenues you may choose to utilize, such as elemental resonance and synergy opportunities. Now, with the roles defined, we can begin to explore the concepts involved in crafting an effective team. The first step in developing a strong team is to decide who that team will be built around. This means you first need to choose a primary DPS. For this purpose, I will use my own 2 core teams as examples throughout these videos. For my Team 1 primary DPS, I've chosen Mona, and for my Team 2 primary, I've chosen Zhongli. For my stream regulars, this is not a surprise. But it's important to point out that these 2 characters are very different, and will shine best in the primary DPS role when utilizing very different team compositions. What I mean by this is, when building at your primary DPS, you should not only consider how to build that DPS, but also you should consider heavily what sort of character will help that DPS reach peak output potential. And lastly, how those characters might impact what equipment you should use for best results. When choosing the characters you want to aid your primary DPS, it's important to understand also the basic damage mechanics behind the reactions and damage production in Genshin Impact. Starting with the concept which established my Team 1, Mona is the chosen primary DPS for this team. She was chosen as a primary for this team because of her high attack speed and mobility, as well as her ability to control the field through lures or Stellaris bubbles. While these strengths make Mona effective for many encounters, the downside to most Catalyst, Sword, Polearm, or Bow users, with Klee being the clearest exception, is that when facing enemies which have Cryo, Dendro, or Geo shields, the character will generally be ineffective until the shield is dealt with. Mona can simply place lures and reposition to the back side of an enemy, but this is not always an option. So for this reason, you want to surround Catalyst, Sword, Polearm, and Archer-type primary DPS users with characters who can help you deal with this issue. By contrast, if building a team around a Claymore primary DPS, you'll want a secondary DPS capable of reaching enemies who cannot be attacked easily from a position on ground level, a scenario easily solved by much of the roster's Catalyst or Bow users. Going back to the issue at hand, however, with enemies wielding physical shields, Pyro characters bring swift resolution to Dendro and Cryo shields, while Ningguang, Zhongli, or any Claymore users are required to break Geo shields. Klee, Diluc, and Xinjiang are able to solve all 3 of those categories, whilst giving you solid opportunities for reaction damage, as well as resonance potential. But reactions and elemental resonance concepts will be talked in the next installment of this series. It will focus on understanding the different reaction types in Genshin Impact, as well as why elemental resonance is often a good idea to utilize. This concludes the first installment of this series. I hope you found it to be useful. If you did, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so that you're notified when my next video goes live. Thanks for watching Teyvat Historia. May the 7 guide you, travelers.